The rope burns on Martha Corey's wrists had barely healed when she pressed the knife against Magistrate William Stoughton's throat at midnight on October 13, 1692. The metallic tang of fear sweat filled the candlelit chamber, where Salem's most powerful man now trembled like the accused women he'd condemned to hang. This is the story of how 5 women turned the Salem witch trials inside out, transforming from victims into executioners in ways that would haunt Massachusetts for centuries. 3 weeks earlier, Martha had stood shackled in Salem's courthouse, listening to Mercy Lewis shriek that spectral evidence proved her guilt. The magistrates nodded gravely as teenage girls convulsed and pointed fingers, their testimonies built on dreams and spite rather than fact. But Martha noticed something others missed: the way Magistrate Stoughton's eyes lingered on the younger accused women, the particular satisfaction in his voice when sentencing beautiful prisoners to examination, the nervous energy that pulsed through the courtroom whenever he questioned them about their supposed congress with the devil. Now, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you about how the powerless found ways to reclaim power, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records and family secrets for over 3 centuries. Salem Village in October 1692 reeked of wood smoke and rotting apples, while frost crunched underfoot like broken promises. 20 people had already died for witchcraft, their bodies swinging from Gallows Hill as warnings to anyone who dared question the magistrate's authority. But in the shadows of that mad season, 5 women who'd survived their own trials began meeting in secret. Martha Corey, the farmer's wife who dared suggest the afflicted girls might be lying. Rebecca Nurse, the 71-year-old matriarch whose family had feuded with the Putnams for decades. Mary Easty, Rebecca's sister, who'd been released only to be arrested again when the girls' fits grew more violent. Sarah Cloyce, another sister, who'd walked out of Reverend Parris's sermon in disgust. And Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John had already been condemned to hang. They called themselves the Covenant of Truth, though history would remember them by a different name entirely. From the diary of Sarah Good's daughter written years later, Mother always said the real witches in Salem were the ones wearing black robes, not ragged skirts. The Covenant's first meeting took place in Rebecca Nurse's root cellar, where preserved vegetables lined the walls like silent witnesses. Martha had proposed it after overhearing Magistrate Stoughton discussing which properties might become available once their owners were executed. The trials weren't about witchcraft, she'd realized. They were about land, power, and removing inconvenient people who asked too many questions. Elizabeth Proctor's hands shook as she lit the single candle. If we're caught gathering like this, they'll say it proves we're a coven. Let them, Martha replied, her voice steadied despite the healing welts on her back. We've already been condemned for crimes we didn't commit. What's one more accusation? The women shared what they'd learned during their imprisonments. Rebecca described how Stoughton had privately offered her clemency in exchange for sexual favors, then raged when she refused. Mary revealed that Deputy Constable John Willard had confessed his doubts about the trials before being arrested himself. Sarah had witnessed the magistrates dividing maps of condemned prisoners' properties. But what changed everything was Elizabeth's revelation about the afflicted girls. She'd seen Mercy Lewis and Abigail Williams practicing their fits behind Ingersoll's Tavern, timing their convulsions and coaching each other on when to scream. The girls weren't possessed by demons. They were performing for an audience that rewarded their theatrics with attention and power. Then we give them a performance worth remembering, Martha said, her scarred hands folding into fists. Justice in Salem had become a carnival where innocence meant nothing and accusations everything. But carnivals, the women knew, could be turned upside down with the right kind of pressure applied in the right places at the right time. Death comes in many forms. The Covenant spent 2 weeks preparing, meeting in different locations each night. Rebecca's knowledge of herbal remedies from decades of village healing. Martha's understanding of the magistrate's schedules from her husband's work as a landowner, Elizabeth's insights into the accuser's patterns and weaknesses. They weren't planning random violence, but surgical strikes against the system that had branded them as monsters. Their first target wouldn't be Stoughton, despite his position as chief magistrate. It would be someone whose death would send a message, while seeming like divine judgment rather than human intervention. But which member of Salem's power structure had made the fatal mistake of underestimating what desperate women might do when their backs were pressed against the wall of their own graves? Reverend Samuel Parris discovered his study door ajar at 4:17 in the morning. Candle wax pooled on his desk like congealed tears. The man who'd ignited Salem's madness by declaring his own daughter and niece bewitched now lay face down in his sermon notes, a kitchen knife protruding from between his shoulder blades where his heart should have been. The Covenant had chosen their first victim with the precision of a surgeon selecting exactly which artery to sever. Parris represented everything corrupt about the trials. A man who'd used his daughter's mysterious illness to settle scores with parishioners who'd questioned his salary, his sermons, his very right to lead Salem's congregation. His accusations had started the cascade of fear that now threatened to drown the entire colony in blood. But more importantly, his death could be made to look like divine retribution rather than human justice. Martha had slipped through his kitchen window while the village slept, her movements silent as winter mist across frozen ground. Years of caring for livestock had taught her exactly where to place a blade to ensure death came swiftly, but not silently enough to wake the household. Parris had time for one gurgled prayer before darkness claimed him. His final words, a plea to the same God he'd invoked while condemning innocent women. The scene Martha left behind told a story the magistrates wouldn't want to believe, but couldn't ignore. Parris's own Bible lay open to Exodus 23, verse 1. Thou shalt not raise a false report. His sermon notes for the coming Sunday were scattered, blood-stained pages revealing his plan to name 5 more women as confederates of Satan. Most damning of all, Martha had arranged his ledger to show payments received from families whose neighbors had been conveniently accused of witchcraft. When Parris's wife discovered the body at dawn, her screams echoed across Salem village like a bell tolling backward through time. But the Covenant had anticipated even this, positioning themselves throughout the village to observe reactions and spread carefully crafted whispers about divine judgment falling upon false prophets. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Rebecca Nurse murmured to her shocked neighbors, her voice carrying just the right note of pious concern. Perhaps the Reverend's own sins finally caught up with him. The investigation that followed revealed cracks in Salem's foundation that even Chief Magistrate Stoughton couldn't ignore. Constable George Herrick, a practical man who'd grown uncomfortable with the trial's increasing violence, noted the precise placement of the wound. Whoever did this knew anatomy. He told Stoughton privately, this wasn't random violence or robbery. Someone wanted Parris dead. Specifically, more troubling was the message found pinned to Parris's study wall, written in what appeared to be his own hand. I have borne false witness against the innocent. May God forgive what I cannot undo. From the Essex County Court Records, October 14th, 1692. Reverend Parris found deceased under suspicious circumstances. Investigation ongoing. Note: recent disputes over church governance and salary may be relevant. Stoughton ordered increased security around all magistrates and court officials, but the damage was already done. For the first time since the trials began, Salem's leaders felt vulnerable. The accusers had become the hunted, and everyone knew it. The afflicted girl's reactions proved most interesting. Mercy Lewis, the 17-year-old whose violent fits had condemned dozens, seemed genuinely terrified when told of Parris's death. Her subsequent accusations grew wilder, less focused, as if she'd lost her script. Abigail Williams, Parris's own niece, withdrew entirely, claiming the devil had murdered her uncle for trying to expose his servants. But Mary Warren, the servant girl who'd briefly recanted her testimony before being threatened with accusation herself, made a statement that chilled even hardened court observers. Maybe the real witches are finally showing themselves. The Covenant watched these developments with careful satisfaction from their separate positions throughout the village. They'd struck the first blow against Salem's reign of terror, but one death wouldn't be enough to stop the machine they'd set in motion. The trials had taken on a momentum of their own, feeding on fear and property disputes that ran deeper than any single man's ambitions. Silence fell like fresh snow. That evening, as Paris's body was prepared for burial, Elizabeth Proctor visited her condemned husband in Salem's jail. Through iron bars, she whispered updates about their developing plan. John's execution was scheduled for November 4th, giving them 3 weeks to either stop the trials entirely or die trying. "You're playing with forces beyond mortal understanding," John warned, though his eyes showed pride rather than fear. "These men have the colony's full authority behind them." "Then we'll have to become something more than mortal," Elizabeth replied, her scarred hand steady as she passed him bread through the bars. "They made us into witches in their accusations. Perhaps it's time we showed them what real witches can accomplish." The conversation was overheard by Deputy Constable John Willard, the same man who'd been arrested for questioning the trial's legitimacy. But instead of reporting Elizabeth's words, he simply nodded and walked away, his silence another crack in Salem's crumbling facade of righteousness. Outside, October wind rattled bare branches against jail walls, while stars wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed to mock human notions of justice. The Covenant had drawn first blood, but their true test lay ahead. Because Magistrate Stoughton had just announced plans to accelerate the remaining executions, starting with a mass hanging that would eliminate 8 accused witches in a single morning, including Elizabeth Proctor herself. The gallows on Proctor's ledge groaned under fresh timber as carpenters worked by torchlight, expanding the platform to accommodate 8 nooses instead of the usual 1 or 2. The sound of hammering echoed across Salem, like a carpenter building coffins for the living, while Chief Magistrate Stoughton watched from his carriage with the satisfaction of a man solving multiple problems at once. The mass execution scheduled for October 26th would eliminate the most vocal opponents of the trials in a single stroke, including Elizabeth Proctor and Martha Corey. Stoughton had grown impatient with the slow pace of individual hangings. Each execution gave the condemned time to make speeches from the gallows, declarations of innocence that stirred doubt among spectators. Bridget Bishop had died with dignity, maintaining her innocence to the end. Rebecca Nurse's final words had moved even hardened observers to tears. George Burroughs had recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly before his execution, something witches supposedly couldn't do. But 8 executions in rapid succession would overwhelm any individual protests with sheer volume, creating a spectacle so horrific that opposition would be crushed through terror rather than convinced through evidence. "Make it memorable," Stoughton instructed the carpenters. "I want every person in Essex County to understand what happens to those who traffic with Satan." The Covenant learned of the accelerated timeline through Mary Eastie, whose upcoming execution had been moved forward by 2 weeks. Her sister Rebecca passed the information during a carefully choreographed encounter at the village well, where drawing water provided cover for whispered conversations. 26th of October, Rebecca murmured, her bucket scraping against stone. "Dawn, all 8 of us together." Martha absorbed this news with the calculating calm of a woman who'd already accepted death as the likely price of resistance. The Covenant's original plan had involved weeks of careful preparation, systematic elimination of key figures, and gradually building public doubt about the trial's legitimacy. Now they had 9 days to either stop the executions entirely or watch their rebellion die with them on Gallows Hill. That night, in the abandoned root cellar that had become their sanctuary, the 5 women faced their most crucial decision. Sarah Cloyce spoke for all of them when she said, We can't save ourselves through half measures anymore. From the personal notes of Dr. William Griggs, Salem's physician, the condemned women show no signs of the hysteria typically associated with guilt. Their composure suggests either complete innocence or supernatural assistance. Elizabeth Proctor produced a detailed map of Salem Village she'd been drawing during her imprisonment, marking the locations of every magistrate, constable, and key supporter of the trials. Her husband John's execution had been postponed due to her pregnancy claim, but she knew the reprieve was temporary. If the mass hanging proceeded as planned, her unborn child would grow up motherless in a world where accusations could destroy anyone at any time. "Stoughton lives alone since his wife died," she noted, pointing to his isolated house on the village outskirts. "2 servants, both of whom have family members who've been accused. His security consists of a single constable who makes rounds every 2 hours." Martha studied the map with professional interest. "What about Deputy Governor Danforth? He's been pushing for even more executions." "Lives in Boston," Rebecca replied. "Too well guarded, too far away. But he's scheduled to attend our executions as chief witness." The plan that emerged was desperate and brilliant in equal measure. Instead of trying to escape or prove their innocence through legal channels that had already failed them, the Covenant would stage their own witch trial. They would use Salem's fears against itself, demonstrating that the real supernatural threat came not from innocent women gathering herbs, but from the corruption that had infected the colony's leadership. The tools they needed were already within reach. Rebecca's knowledge of medicinal plants included several that could induce realistic symptoms of poisoning. Martha's understanding of village layouts and routines came from decades of farm life. Sarah and Mary's connections among the accused women in jail provided a network of potential allies. Elizabeth's pregnancy gave her access to the jail's medical supplies and sympathetic guards. Most importantly, they had something the magistrates lacked: nothing left to lose. Desperation breeds innovation. The Covenant's second target would be Deputy Constable Joseph Herrick, brother of the more sympathetic George, but a zealous supporter of the trials who'd personally arrested over 30 accused witches. His death would need to appear supernatural, not merely criminal, to achieve the psychological impact they required. "He makes his rounds past the old Proctor house every night at 10:30, Elizabeth observed. "Stops to check the abandoned buildings for vagrants or fugitives. Always alone, always predictable, and always carrying the keys to Salem jail," Martha added with grim satisfaction. They spent 3 days preparing, gathering the necessary herbs and tools while maintaining their separate routines to avoid suspicion. Rebecca used her reputation as a healer to acquire nightshade and foxglove under the pretense of treating livestock ailments. Sarah obtained candles and rope through her family's connections. Martha practiced moving silently through darkness, timing her steps to avoid the creaking floorboards that betrayed movement in old buildings. On the night of October 21st, as autumn wind howled through bare branches like the voices of the already dead, Deputy Constable Herrick began his final patrol of Salem Village. He carried his usual complement of weapons: a sword, a pistol, and the unwavering certainty that God supported his efforts to cleanse Massachusetts of Satan's servants. He never saw Martha Corey waiting in the shadows of the abandoned Proctor house, her scarred hands steady around a rope that would soon teach Salem what real supernatural terror looked like. But the lesson wouldn't end with Herrick's death, because the Covenant had discovered something that would shake the trial's foundation more thoroughly than any individual murder. Evidence that the afflicted girls weren't the only ones practicing deception in Salem Village. Deputy Constable Joseph Herrick's lantern cast dancing shadows between abandoned buildings as he approached the old Proctor house at 10:29, his boots crunching through frost that glittered like scattered diamonds in the moonlight. The leather of his weapon belt creaked with each step, while his breath formed clouds that dissipated into darkness thick enough to hide a dozen watchers. What Herrick didn't know was that Martha Corey had been studying his patrol patterns for 5 nights, timing each stop down to the minute. The abandoned Proctor House stood as a monument to Salem's madness. Its windows boarded shut after John and Elizabeth's arrest left it empty of everything except memories and mice. Herrick always checked the rear entrance, where vagrants sometimes sheltered, a routine that had become as predictable as sunrise. Tonight, that predictability would prove fatal. Martha waited in the kitchen doorway, rope coiled in her hands like a sleeping serpent. She'd learned knot tying from her late father, a ship's carpenter who'd taught her that the right knot applied with sufficient force could solve problems words couldn't touch. The noose she'd prepared was designed not for hanging, but for silent strangulation that would leave specific marks. When Herrick pushed open the back door, lantern raised to illuminate the interior, Martha moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent decades wringing chickens' necks. The rope settled around his throat before he could cry out, tightening with mechanical efficiency as she pulled him backward into darkness. His struggle lasted exactly 37 seconds, long enough for her to whisper in his ear, "This is what real witchcraft looks like." But Martha's true genius lay not in the killing itself, but in what she did afterward. From the Salem Village records, October 22nd, 1692, Deputy Constable Herrick found deceased under circumstances suggesting supernatural intervention. Body positioned in manner consistent with documented accounts of spectral attack. When George Herrick discovered his brother's corpse the following morning, the scene defied rational explanation. Joseph hung suspended 3 feet above the kitchen floor, the rope somehow anchored to a ceiling beam that showed no signs of having been climbed or accessed by ladder. His weapons remained untouched in their sheaths. His purse held all its coins. Most unsettling of all, his body was positioned precisely as described in depositions from alleged witch victims. Arms spread wide, head thrown back, mouth open in a silent scream. Martha had achieved this effect through careful preparation and mechanical advantage, using pulleys hidden in the rafters and counterweights that could be removed after the fact. But to observers who arrived at dawn, Joseph Herrick appeared to have been killed by the same spectral forces the trials claimed to combat. Chief Magistrate Stoughton examined the scene personally, his usual confidence shaken by evidence that seemed to validate the very supernatural threats he'd been prosecuting. "The rope," he muttered, studying the knots. "Where did it come from?" Constable George Herrick held up a familiar coil. "From our own supplies. Joseph was carrying it last night." The implications hung in the air like fog. If witches could turn constables' own equipment against them, if they could strike inside abandoned buildings under official patrol, then nowhere was safe. The hunters had become the hunted, exactly as the Covenant intended. Word of Herrick's supernatural murder spread through Salem Village, faster than news of any previous execution. Unlike the deaths of accused witches, which reinforced the magistrate's authority, this killing suggested that supernatural forces opposed the trials themselves. Whispers began circulating about divine judgment falling upon those who condemn the innocent. "Perhaps," suggested Deacon Edward Putnam during an emergency village meeting, "we should reconsider whether all the accused are truly guilty." Power shifts like seasons. The Covenant gathered that night in a new location, the basement of the abandoned parsonage, where Reverend Parris had once prepared his sermons. Elizabeth Proctor had acquired the keys from Herrick's belt before Martha disposed of the body, giving them access to official documents that revealed the trial's true scope. 73 people currently accused, Elizabeth reported, reading from Herrick's arrest warrants. Property seizures, totaling over £4,000. And this. She held up a letter bearing Governor Phipps's seal. Orders to expand the trials to neighboring towns if Salem proved successful. The witch trials weren't an isolated outbreak of religious hysteria. They were a systematic campaign to redistribute property and eliminate political opposition, with supernatural accusations providing legal cover for what amounted to state-sanctioned theft and murder. Sarah Cloyce studied the documents with growing horror. They're planning to export this madness across all of Massachusetts. Salem is just the beginning. Martha nodded grimly. Which means we can't simply survive our own executions. We have to destroy the entire system before it spreads. The conversation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Mary Warren, the servant girl whose testimony had condemned Elizabeth Proctor. She descended into the basement with tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking as she approached the women she'd helped condemn. "I can't do it anymore," she whispered. "They're making me name my own mother next." Abigail Williams said, "If I don't accuse her of teaching me witchcraft, they'll turn the magistrates against me instead." Rebecca Nurse studied the girl with practiced eyes that had seen decades of village politics. "What do you want from us, child?" "Teach me how to fight back," Mary replied. "I know you killed Paris and Herrick. I know you're planning something bigger. I want to help." The admission hung between them like a bridge that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Mary Warren represented everything the Covenant opposed, a young woman forced to destroy others to save herself. But she also represented something they desperately needed: inside access to the afflicted girls who'd driven Salem's madness from the beginning. Outside, church bells tolled midnight across a village where sleep brought no peace and morning promised only fresh accusations. The mass execution was still 5 days away, but the Covenant had just gained an ally whose betrayal of the accusers might prove more valuable than any amount of rope or poison. Because Mary Warren knew something about the afflicted girls that even the magistrates didn't suspect. They weren't just performing fits for attention or avoiding work. Mary Warren's hands trembled as she traced patterns in the basement dirt, her voice barely above a whisper while autumn rain drummed against the abandoned parsonage walls like fingers tapping impatiently on a coffin lid. The scent of damp earth mixed with lingering incense from Paris's abandoned rituals, while candlelight flickered across faces that had learned to hide their thoughts behind masks of practiced innocence. The afflicted girls weren't just performing fits to avoid punishment or gain attention, Mary revealed to the stunned Covenant members. Abigail Williams found something in her uncle's study before the accusation started. Mary began, her words coming faster as the truth spilled out like water through a broken dam. Letters from magistrates in other colonies describing how witch trials could be used to seize property from political enemies. Instructions on which symptoms to look for, which accusations carried the most weight in court. Elizabeth Proctor leaned forward, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, but her attention sharp as a blade. "You're saying the girls knew this was all fabricated from the beginning?" "Worse than that," Mary replied. "They were recruited, promised portions of the seized estates if they played their parts convincingly. Abigail gets a percentage of every property confiscated from someone she accuses. Mercy Lewis has already received £50 from the Henderson farm seizure." The revelation struck the basement like lightning, illuminating a landscape they'd thought they understood. The afflicted girls weren't victims of supernatural forces or even mass hysteria. They were paid performers in a theatrical production designed to transfer wealth from one group of colonists to another, with the colonial government providing legal framework for what amounted to organized theft. Martha Corey absorbed this information with the grim satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions had been confirmed. "Who's paying them?" "That's what I'm trying to tell you," Mary said, producing a crumpled paper from her sleeve. "It's not just local magistrates. This goes all the way to Boston." From Mary Warren's testimony, recorded in the Covenant cipher, Deputy Governor Danforth receives detailed reports on all property seizures. Governor Phipps approved the expansion plan personally. The witch trials are colonial policy, not local madness. The document Mary showed them was a payment ledger written in Abigail Williams's careful hand, listing compensation for specific accusations. Bridget Bishop's execution had earned Abigail £12. The Nurse family accusations brought £15 each for Abigail and Mercy Lewis. Most damning of all, bonuses were promised for accusations that led to executions rather than mere imprisonment. They've turned murder into a business, Rebecca Nurse said, her voice carrying the weight of someone whose family had been specifically targeted for their prosperous farm, and they're franchising it across Massachusetts. Sarah Cloyce studied the payment amounts with calculating eyes. These sums are too large for local magistrates to afford. Someone with serious money is funding this operation. Mary nodded miserably. Merchant families in Boston who want access to inland properties. They can't buy directly from established farmers, so they're using witch trials to force sales at confiscation prices. The conspiracy was larger and more sophisticated than any of them had imagined. Salem's witch trials weren't the product of religious extremism or adolescent hysteria, but a carefully orchestrated land grab that used supernatural terror as cover for economic warfare. Truth cuts deeper than any blade. The Covenant faced a terrible choice. Their original plan to kill key magistrates might eliminate local enforcers, but it wouldn't touch the Boston merchants and colonial officials who designed the system. Meanwhile, the mass execution scheduled for October 26th would eliminate their leadership, just as they'd uncovered evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. "We need to get this information to someone with authority to stop the trials," Elizabeth suggested. "Who?" Martha replied bitterly. Governor Phipps approved the expansion. Deputy Governor Danforth is managing the property seizures. Chief Magistrate Stoughton is their local enforcer. The only authority higher than colonial government is the Crown, and they're 3,000 miles away. Mary Warren offered an unexpected solution. Reverend Increase Mather is returning from London next week. He's been trying to convince the Crown to intervene in colonial affairs. If he had proof that the trials were being used for illegal property seizure, he'd have grounds to petition for royal intervention, Rebecca finished. The Crown doesn't tolerate colonial officials using legal proceedings for personal enrichment. The plan that emerged was audacious even by the Covenant standards. Instead of simply killing their oppressors, they would stage a supernatural event so dramatic and well documented that it would force the trials to stop, while simultaneously providing evidence of the underlying conspiracy to authorities who could act on it. They would fake their own resurrections. The logistics were complex but achievable. Rebecca's herbal knowledge included plants that could slow heartbeat and breathing to nearly undetectable levels. Martha's understanding of burial procedures came from decades of farm life, where death was a constant presence. Elizabeth's access to jail records would let them time everything precisely. Sarah and Mary's connections could ensure the right people witnessed their miraculous return from the grave. Most importantly, they would stage their resurrections with the payment ledger and other documents hidden on their bodies, providing irrefutable evidence of the trial's true nature to whoever examined them. The mass execution is our opportunity, Martha realized. 8 women dying together will draw maximum attention. When we return from the dead carrying proof of the conspiracy, even the most skeptical observers will have to listen. Outside, Salem's church bells rang the midnight hour across a village where fear had become currency and accusations had replaced honest work. The Covenant had 3 days to prepare for their own deaths and resurrections, but they'd finally found a way to expose the truth behind Salem's madness. Because Mary Warren had revealed something else about the afflicted girl's conspiracy, they were planning to expand beyond property seizure into something even more sinister. The coffins arrived at dawn on October 24th, their pine boards still bleeding sap while carpenters' apprentices hammered iron nails through wood that would hold 8 women for exactly 18 hours. The sound echoed across Salem village like a drummer counting down to execution, while morning mist clung to Gallows Hill as if the earth itself mourned what was coming. Mary Warren had revealed the afflicted girl's ultimate plan: to expand accusations beyond property seizure into targeting every family with unmarried daughters of marriageable age. "They're building a monopoly on eligible women," Mary explained during the Covenant's final planning session in the abandoned parsonage basement. "Families with accused mothers can't arrange proper marriages. Their daughters become servants, or worse, while the accusers position themselves as the only pure young women available for advantageous matches. The social engineering was breathtaking in its scope. By systematically destroying competing families through witchcraft accusations, Abigail Williams and her Confederates would corner Salem's marriage market, ensuring their own advancement while eliminating rivals. They weren't just stealing property, they were restructuring the colony's entire social hierarchy. Elizabeth Proctor studied the detailed timing charts Rebecca had prepared, each woman's role in their resurrection performance mapped down to the minute. The hanging is scheduled for 8 in the morning. We'll need to maintain the death simulation for at least 6 hours to ensure adequate witnesses observe our bodies. The risks are substantial, Rebecca warned, her healer's knowledge making her acutely aware of how easily their plan could become genuine execution. Too much of the plant extract and we die for real. Too little and the deception fails. Martha flexed her scarred hands with grim determination. We've already died in every way that matters. Our reputations, our property, our place in this community. What's left to lose? Except our ability to expose the truth. The preparation was meticulous. Each woman would consume carefully measured doses of foxglove and nightshade mixed with Rebecca's own herbal preparations, creating symptoms that mimicked death while maintaining minimal life functions. They'd practice the timing repeatedly, learning to slow their breathing and heartbeat through concentration techniques Rebecca had observed during her decades of attending deathbeds. Most crucially, they'd sewn the payment ledger and other evidence into the lining of Elizabeth's dress, positioned where examining physicians would discover them during the traditional post-hanging verification of death. From the private journal of Dr. William Griggs, the condemned women show unusual calm for those facing execution. Either they possess remarkable faith or knowledge we lack. The morning of October 26th brought gray skies and bitter wind that cut through wool cloaks like accusations through friendship. Salem Village gathered on Gallows Hill in unprecedented numbers, drawn by curiosity about the mass execution and rumors that supernatural forces opposed the trials. Chief Magistrate Stoughton arrived in his formal robes, accompanied by Deputy Governor Danforth and a delegation from Boston, whose presence confirmed the trial's political importance. They took positions on a specially constructed platform that provided clear views of both the gallows and the crowd, their faces showing the satisfaction of men watching a successful business venture reach completion. The 8 condemned women were led up Gallows Hill in chains, their movements carefully coordinated to ensure the Covenant members could observe each other's condition. Rebecca Nurse walked with dignity despite her 71 years. Martha Corey maintained the defiant posture that had marked her throughout the trial process. Elizabeth Proctor's pregnancy showed clearly beneath her execution dress, adding emotional weight to the spectacle. As the nooses were positioned, each woman spoke their final words with calculated precision. Instead of traditional prayers or protestations of innocence, they delivered coordinated testimony that laid groundwork for their planned resurrection. When we returned, Martha declared loudly enough for all spectators to hear, "We will carry proof of Salem's true sins. The dead shall speak truths the living dare not voice," Rebecca added, her clear voice carrying across the hillside. Death was never the ending. The executions proceeded with mechanical efficiency. 8 women dropped simultaneously as the platform fell away, their bodies swaying in autumn wind while spectators watched in hushed silence. Dr. Griggs examined each body according to legal requirements, pronouncing them dead after finding no detectable pulse or breathing. But Rebecca's herbal preparations had worked exactly as planned. The women hung in carefully controlled comas, their life signs reduced to levels undetectable by 17th century medical knowledge, while their minds remained partially aware of their surroundings. The bodies were cut down after an hour of public display and transported to Salem Village's common grave, where they would be buried in the mass plot reserved for executed criminals. This provided exactly the scenario the Covenant needed: shallow burial in easily accessible ground, where their planned resurrection could be staged with maximum dramatic impact. As sunset approached and burial preparations continued, Mary Warren positioned herself among the spectators who'd remained to witness the interment. She carried a small handbell and instructions to begin ringing it the moment any of the buried women showed signs of movement. The plan was audacious. The women would revive during burial, emerge from their graves carrying evidence of the trial's corruption, and force Salem to confront the truth about what had been done in the name of fighting witchcraft. But as dirt began falling on their wooden coffins and consciousness slowly returned to their poisoned minds, the Covenant discovered that their resurrection would be witnessed by more than just curious villagers. Because someone else had been planning to use the mass execution for their own purposes, and that person had no intention of allowing the buried women to return from the dead. The shovel struck frozen earth with a dull thud of metal against reluctance, while gravedigger Thomas Putnam worked by lantern light to complete the mass burial before midnight. The smell of disturbed soil mixed with pine sap from hastily constructed coffins, and somewhere in the darkness beyond his circle of light, footsteps circled the common grave like a predator stalking wounded prey. Putnam wasn't alone on Gallows Hill, and the figure watching him had no intention of allowing the Covenant's resurrection to proceed as planned. Deputy Governor Thomas Danforth had remained in Salem after the executions, officially to ensure proper burial procedures, but actually to verify that the most dangerous opponents of the trials were truly dead. His political survival depended on the witch trial system expanding across Massachusetts, and he'd grown suspicious of the condemned women's unusual confidence during their final moments. 8 women speaking of returning from death, he'd muttered to his aide while watching the burial preparations. Either they possessed genuine supernatural powers, or they knew something we don't. Danforth's investigation had uncovered disturbing intelligence. His network of informants reported unusual activity around abandoned buildings where the accused women had been seen gathering. More troubling, Deputy Constable Herrick's death showed clear signs of human planning rather than spectral intervention, suggesting an organized resistance movement operating within Salem Village. The deputy governor positioned himself in the tree line overlooking the common grave, armed with a loaded musket and accompanied by 2 trusted constables from Boston who owed their positions to his patronage. If any of the buried women showed signs of revival, they would be shot immediately and reburied in separate locations to prevent further coordination. From Danforth's encrypted correspondence, the Salem operation must not be compromised by local complications. Expansion to Worcester and Springfield depends on maintaining supernatural credibility. Below, in their shallow graves, the Covenant members struggled back to consciousness as Rebecca's herbal preparations gradually wore off. The transition was agonizing, their bodies fighting to resume normal functions while dirt pressed down on their coffin lids like the weight of Salem's accumulated lies. Martha regained awareness first, her farmer's constitution proving most resistant to the plant toxins. The coffin space was cramped and airless, filled with the earthy smell of fresh burial and the metallic taste of fear. She pressed against the pine lid, testing its resistance, and felt it give slightly under pressure. Elizabeth's revival came next, accompanied by sharp pains from her pregnancy that reminded her of the life growing within her, despite their desperate gamble. The evidence sewn into her dress crinkled against her ribs, documents that could destroy the trials if she survived to present them. Rebecca's age made her recovery slower but more determined. 7 decades of witnessing Salem's political machinations had taught her that survival often depended on patience rather than strength. She waited until her heartbeat stabilized before attempting movement. Above ground, Mary Warren crouched behind a headstone with her signal bell, watching for any indication that the buried women were stirring. She'd positioned herself carefully to observe both the graves and the surrounding darkness, but failed to notice the armed figures in the tree line. The first sign of resurrection came at 11:47, when Martha's coffin lid shifted visibly as she pushed against it from within. The movement was slight but unmistakable in the lantern light, causing gravedigger Putnam to step backward with a curse. "Mother of God," he whispered, crossing himself. "They're coming back." Mary Warren raised her bell to begin signaling, but the sound was cut short by a musket shot that split the midnight air like thunder. Danforth had fired not at the emerging women, but at Mary herself, eliminating the witness who could spread word of their resurrection. Resurrection requires witnesses. The shot echoed across Gallows Hill, alerting everyone within a mile that something extraordinary was happening at the execution site. But it also provided cover for the Covenant's emergence, as Danforth's men rushed to reload their single-shot weapons. Martha burst from her grave like a fury, rising from the earth itself, dirt cascading from her burial dress as she emerged into lantern light. Her scarred hands clutched the evidence she'd hidden, while her eyes blazed with the intensity of someone who'd literally returned from the dead. Rebecca followed moments later, her white hair wild with soil, and her ancient voice carrying across the hillside. "Behold, the innocent, whom Salem murdered." Elizabeth's emergence was the most dramatic, her pregnant form rising from the earth like a terrible prophecy of what the trials would cost Massachusetts if allowed to continue. The evidence sewn into her dress was clearly visible, promising revelations that would shake the colony's foundations. But Danforth and his men were already moving, their reloaded weapons aimed at the resurrected women. The deputy governor understood that allowing these women to live and speak would destroy everything he'd built through the witch trial system. "Kill them all," he commanded his constables. "Kill them now." The confrontation that followed would determine whether Salem's madness continued to spread across Massachusetts or died on the same hill where so many innocents had already perished. But the Covenant had one final surprise prepared, something they'd learned from Mary Warren about the afflicted girl's conspiracy. Because the evidence Elizabeth carried didn't just document payments to accusers, it revealed the names of prominent Boston families who'd funded the entire operation, including several with direct connections to the colonial government itself. The musket balls whistled through midnight air like angry wasps, splintering headstones and sending fragments of carved marble spinning into darkness, while Deputy Governor Danforth's constables reloaded with the mechanical precision of men accustomed to killing witnesses. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with disturbed grave dirt, and in the lantern light, 3 women who'd returned from death faced the same forces that had murdered them hours earlier. But the Covenant had anticipated this final confrontation, and Martha Corey held something more dangerous than any weapon: the complete truth about Salem's conspiracy. "Thomas Danforth," Martha called across the graveyard, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd literally died for the right to speak. "Before you murder us again, perhaps your constables should know which Boston families have been paying their salaries." She held up the evidence Elizabeth had sewn into her burial dress, documents that gleamed in the lantern light, like accusations given physical form. The papers contained not just payment records to the afflicted girls, but detailed correspondence between colonial officials and merchant families who'd orchestrated the entire witch trial system. "The Mather family," Martha continued, her scarred hands steady as she unfolded the first document, £50 per successful property seizure. "The Winthrop estate, 30% of all confiscated farmland. Governor Phipps himself, £200 for expanding the trials to Worcester County." Elizabeth stepped forward despite her pregnancy, adding her voice to the revelation. "Your own payment, Deputy Governor, £300 to ensure the Salem trials produced enough executions to justify expansion across Massachusetts." The constables hesitated, their weapons wavering as they absorbed the implications. They'd believed themselves servants of justice, not hired killers protecting a land-grabbing conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of colonial government. Rebecca Nurse, oldest and most respected of the resurrected women, delivered the final blow. "Every family you've helped destroy, every woman you've watched hang, every child orphaned by these trials. All of it for money, while you told yourselves you served God." From the recovered documents of the Salem conspiracy, The witch trial model proves highly effective for property redistribution. Recommend immediate expansion to all inland counties with valuable farmland. Danforth realized his position had become untenable. The constables were loyal to the colonial government, but that loyalty wouldn't survive learning they'd been murdering innocent people to enrich Boston merchants. His political career, the trial system, everything he'd built would collapse if these women lived to present their evidence. "Kill them," he ordered desperately. "They're demons wearing familiar faces. Don't listen to their lies." But the constables had seen too much truth in too short a time. Instead of raising their weapons, they stepped backward, their faces showing the horror of men discovering they'd been tools of evil while believing themselves instruments of justice. "We won't fire on unarmed women," the senior constable declared. Not again. The moment stretched like a held breath, while Salem's entire future balanced on the edge of decision. Around them, other figures emerged from the darkness. Villagers awakened by gunfire, surviving family members of the executed, even some of the afflicted girls who'd come to witness the aftermath of their performance. Mercy Lewis and Abigail Williams stood at the crowd's edge, their faces pale with terror as they realized their conspiracy was collapsing. The supernatural resurrection of their victims provided perfect theater for exposing the truth about Salem's madness. "Truth rises, like morning mist," Martha addressed the growing crowd with the clear voice of someone who'd paid the ultimate price for the right to speak. Salem has been deceived. The witch trials were never about fighting Satan. They were about stealing land, eliminating political opposition, and enriching families in Boston who wanted access to our property. She displayed each document methodically, reading names and payment amounts, while the crowd grew larger and angrier. The revelation that respected colonial officials had orchestrated mass murder for profit struck Salem's residents like lightning, illuminating a landscape they thought they understood. Deputy Governor Danforth made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "These are forgeries created by genuine witches who've returned from hell to spread confusion." "Then explain this," Elizabeth replied, producing the final piece of evidence. Danforth's own signed authorization for the mass execution, with notations about property seizures scheduled for the following week. The crowd's mood turned ugly as they realized how completely they'd been manipulated. Families who'd supported the trials discovered they'd been enablers of organized theft. Parents who'd encouraged their children to make accusations learned they'd been training them as accessories to murder. Danforth drew his sword in desperation, but found himself surrounded by angry villagers who no longer saw him as a respected official, but as the architect of their community's destruction. His constables made no move to protect him, their loyalty dissolved by the revelation of how thoroughly they'd been deceived. The confrontation ended not with violence, but with justice. Danforth was restrained by his own former supporters, while the Covenant presented their evidence to the crowd. The witch trials collapsed that night on Gallows Hill, brought down by 3 women who'd literally died and returned to expose the truth. Within a week, Governor Phipps had suspended all witch trial proceedings pending investigation. Within a month, the entire conspiracy was exposed, leading to the arrest of several prominent Boston families and the permanent end of spectral evidence in colonial courts. The afflicted girls fled Salem in the night, their payment system exposed and their credibility destroyed. Some say they established themselves in other colonies under different names, but their power to destroy lives through accusations died on the hill where their victims returned from the grave. Even today, visitors to Salem report strange encounters on October nights when the veil between worlds grows thin. The sound of shovels striking earth where no one digs, lantern light moving through abandoned graveyards, and the voices of women speaking truths that echo across centuries. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.